This month we have more wonderful archaeological news to dissect and discuss for your delectation and delight. And we're going to start with on our ongoing watching brief mission. We're going to start this month with um, some news to keep an eye on. In fact, news which is delayed our recording by about an hour today. Um, in so much as the government apparently tried to float a balloon at the weekend and then put out the door around midnight last night some proposals regarding the planning system. And this is something which I know Andy certainly feels that is likely to result in a special later this month, and it sounds as though it could be quite have quite an impact on the livelihoods of archaeologists, shall we say, potentially. So, what's going on, Mr. Brockman? What's going on, Andy? And what should we keep an eye out for?
Right. The background to this is that governments over the last 10 years, conservative governments over the last 10 years, have tried to, quote, reform the planning system. That's
Mm,
the system whereby developers can go to a local authority and say, I want to build such and such there.
hmm
And the local authority goes through a system which says, well, you can build that there only if you, for example, do an environmental impact assessment, which means counting the trees and also checking if there's any archaeology there. It's the whole basis of commercial archaeology in this country that archaeology is done as archaeological assessments are done as part of the planning system. Uh,
And also,
from
at the risk of sounding a little bit Borisian, there, it's not. It's more than just counting trees, isn't it? It's an environmental assessment as to what's present.
I was
I know you were
joking. I
joking,
was
but
winding you up.
it's the thing is though, it's these sorts of witticisms and pithy comments which
Yeah.
allow this sort of policy to get past 80% of the public,
Ab,
if that's what I mean. So
ab,
that's the only reason why
ab,
I'm saying that. That's all. Yeah.
no, no, you're absolutely right. You're quite right to stop me being a smart ass. Um,
You might say that I couldn't possibly comment.
trying to be a smart ass. Um, no, the point is that conservative governments in particular have tried to reform the planning system for some
Mhm.
time. That there is an argument broadly speaking, on the right of politics, though it does appear on the left as well, that planning planning delays prevent the building, for example, of social housing in a timely way for key workers.
Mm.
Um, Now, all the evidence is that planning archaeology and what Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, dismissed in a speech a few months ago as newt counting,
Mhm.
uh, doesn't actually delay building housing. What prevents housing targets being met are, for example, large developers land banking. So they'll, for example, buy a piece of land, get planning permission for it, and then just bank it without building anything, in anticipation of either building on it eventually when the prices go up sufficiently they can make a bigger profit,
Mhm.
or selling it on with planning permission in place to make a profit.
Well, and also
So
as the pressure increases, uh, the notion of increased subsidies and incentives for developers to build. So essentially, government money underwriting this sort of project, or offering tax incentives, so on and so forth. So banking
uh,
it is a very real option, isn't it?
absolutely, and it is absolutely banking in the sense of by banking the land, they anticipate making more money in future.
Mm.
So uh, basically, uh, the Johnson government promised it was going to do unspecified things to reform and, in its words, the planning system in its manifesto. Last Sunday, Robert Jenrick, the minister responsible at the Ministry for Communities and Local Government, which administers the planning system,
hmm
wrote an article in the Telegraph, Sunday Telegraph, um, basically trumpeting the core premise um, of their new white paper, which was that there will be a three-tier zoning system of all the land in England.
Mm.
Planning's devolved to Wales and Scotland, so there are different rules in Wales and Scotland and the north of Ireland. Um, but in England, what will happen is that there'll be a three-tier allocation of land. So land is protected, which includes things like national parks and greenbelt, land which is appropriate for development, and then land which is for development. And in the land which is designated as being for development, there will be automatic planning permission.
Yeah.
Now, that would be a big break with the past, because in the past, the system has been decided on a case by case basis, and there is no such thing as automatic planning permission.
No.
Now, the government's sort of chipped away at this in the last few weeks by extending what are called permitted development rights, which are things that you can do without having to go for planning permission. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, converting a shop into flats. Um, and But that has been criticised by many people, not least architects, but also social people involved in social activism, who say that it actually all it does is give a carte blanche for really poor quality housing. There was a case, for example, of small flats that were built with no natural light in a converted industrial building.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well,
that's the background.
well, so, and in that context, that's the sort of thing that you expect, maybe in the very densely certain very densely areas like Tokyo, or
Yeah,
for example, actually in the worst instances of that sort of thing, because there are workarounds if it's done responsibly. But in the very
absolutely.
worst instance, we're essentially talking about the S word, slums, aren't we? Mm.
That word has been used, and in fact, it was used in the front page of the Guardian today.
Yeah.
Um, for example, the Royal Institute of British Architects have also opposed this
Mm.
quotes liberalisation quite vehemently in a statement that was released a couple of days ago. Now, we'll unpick this properly, because I think we are going to be doing a special on this.
Mhm.
But where we are this morning, and the reason we were the recording was delayed is because I was checking up on what's being said and what has been said and so on. Basically, at midnight last night, Genric's department slipped out a white paper, which is basically a government statement of intent,
Mhm.
called Planning for the Future. Now, it is not draft legislation, which is the really interesting thing. It was being trumpeted on Sunday as a done deal. It's not. What this is a 48-page consultation document, which is going to be out to consultation for 3 months.
Mm.
I won't go into the full details here. People can read it online. We'll post the link.
Mhm.
And as I say, we will be doing, I think, a special on this to discuss it in more detail. Uh, Suffice to say, though, for now, it's a very interesting document. It is somewhat more timid, perhaps, than was being trumpeted on Sunday, in that, as I said, it's not a done deal, it's a consultation.
Mhm.
At the same time, there are things in it like the zoning system, automatic planning permission, the removal of at least one tier of local authority scrutiny of planning for local areas,
Mm.
which are going to be really controversial.
Mhm.
Um, Heritage is mentioned, not in great detail, and in fact, there's a big gap in the document, which the document itself admits, around environmental issues, and it says there'll be a further consultation on environmental issues later on this year, probably.
Which is
S-
fascinating. I mean, again, we don't want to preempt the special
mm,
the exciting special that we're going to do, but it's fascinating because uh, we're, by definition we're talking about interacting with the environment, whether that's considered to be the natural environment, the urban environment, the brown belt, or the historic environment. This is changing the environment. It's interesting that they feel that
yes.
they can chop it up like this. But actually, I mean, as the byline in the Guardian piece that came out this morning, well, a Guardian piece that came out this morning, headline of which is "Race to the Bottom: Reform to Planning System in England Could Be Catastrophic." They say that the government's dramatic building reforms are likely to cut democratic input into planning
Yeah.
process by half.
Yes.
Um, which as I always, there's that one guy who always pops back into my head, that one comment from years ago where it's like, you're against house building, we need houses in this country. we're not against house building. We're against it being done in a rushed, hurried way, which is possibly damaging to human life in terms of quality of life, and also actually culture. Culture is an aspect of human life as well, culture and history. And there's a figure here from Shelter, the homeless charity, on the BBC article that we'll also link to below, which says that 280,000 homes. That's more than a large town. Received permission in England, planning permission that is, between 2011 and 2016, but they were never built. So again, this is not desktop assessment delaying this. This is not historical or environmental concerns delaying this stuff. This is developers being greedy. And if you get rid of environmental protections, the concern is certainly a concern that I can't help but think of, is that what will happen is that's a wonderful way of reducing costs for those folks. They don't have to factor in mitigating or as we've talked about in previous watching briefs, the so-called polluter pays principle means that won't have to follow that. They won't have to to factor in the cost of cleaning up environmental damage, mitigating those concerns, or doing, for example, excavations ahead of development to see what historic remains might be on site, and then potentially budgeting to preserve those remains if that's required. So costs will go down, but there's no, at the moment at least, there's no seemingly push or even carrot or stick incentive to make those people use that land that they own, um, which which is odd if your goal is to make sure that houses are being built, isn't it? Um, mm,
Absolutely. Uh, it's worth saying as well that the other thing that's striking about the document is that it is very keen on, um, well, somebody did a word count uh, on the white paper overnight, and it turns out the word beautiful, I think, is mentioned something like 52 times. It's very keen on sense of place, and the government did have a commission, a committee looking at beauty and design in urban in building design under the chairmanship of the late Roger Scruton, the Conservative academic,
mhm,
which actually produced a pretty well-regarded report saying we need to design better looking buildings. We should, that are more responsive to local traditions, appropriate materials, that kind of thing.
mhm,
And that's all there in the white paper consultation.
mm.
So it's not all bad.
Well, it's interesting.
Um,
It's interesting you should mention that. Given that this is meant to be a relatively brief section at the beginning of the watching brief, it's
sorry,
interesting.
yeah.
No, no, it's interesting that you should mention that in so much as there's an argument happening at the moment in York, which I'll put the link to below. I'll add that link to the watching brief agenda, where the so-called Roman Quarter is being proposed. And historic groups are up in arms about the quality and the nature of the buildings, in particular, and the nature of the architecture. So there is something. There's it's a cultural thing, isn't it, in terms of what constitutes development, what constitutes, because essentially when you're building, especially new homes or in particular new business or office space, new schools as well. Actually, I remember my school back in Wales when they extended it and built the library. There's something about architecture that is trying to communicate something about aspiration, about, this is the new bright shiny future that you get to live in, this kind of thing. And I suppose there's this interesting tension between uh, being, I suppose, avant-garde and introducing new materials and new exciting architectural elements, and having that be, well, and actually, as your man there describes, be something which is live withable, and it's not just
Yeah,
being, it's not just the old sort of, it doesn't quite meet the rustic aesthetic of our village. It's not that kind of
yeah,
thing. It's much more about the quality of life, isn't it, that the building engender. And if they are at
yeah,
odds with people's psychology, then that's a bad start. And so there's room here in this conversation to have some very interesting outcomes, I suppose.
indeed.
Hmm.
Indeed, and we will continue the conversation in future, and in fact, this is going to be an ongoing debate. As I say, the consultation is going to run for 3 months.
Hmm.
There'll then be draft legislation, lots of lobbying. I suspect, even with a majority of 80, um, potentially some friction in Parliament and the House of Lords and in the House of Commons from the Conservative backbenches.
Mm.
People in traditional Shire Tory seats where uh, the people will be worried that new housing estates will be appearing on the outskirts of the village
Mm.
where where they live, and the village green was established in 1500. It's that kind of argument will be had. It is likely to get quite vociferous, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and just one, I suppose, one final little flag I would just put for food for thought on this is going to be how those conversations are allowed to unfold in different parts of the country. In so
Yeah.
much as I imagine people in the Cotswolds are much more likely to understand perhaps their village's history and things like when the village green was established
Mm.
in a much more public way than perhaps the arguments might be made, say, in a place like Wallsend. There's something about a post-industrial landscape which is seen as already marred, and therefore you can build wherever you want. And therefore, so
Absolutely.
again,
And
there's something about the psychology of this, and especially the north-south divide as well.
the last thing I'm going to say on this net for now,
Yeah.
I think, is I think you're absolutely right there. And I think, the work you did on the BMX track project
Mm,
is a case in point here,
mm,
um, where, something that would be disregarded by many people, and if that a site like that might be seen as something that could very easily be bulldozed and built on. You've there,
well,
you've got something
the
that's
council said that they wanted to at one point, but go ahead.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, I think the crucial point here for our archaeological audience, if they're still watching, I hope they still are, is that I think it's absolutely essential here that we reach outside of archaeology world,
Mm,
and not just reach outside of archaeology world to have this dialogue about the places that we want to make, because
mm,
as archaeologists we don't live in the past, we live in places too,
yeah. Mm,
and going forward and bring up our families in places
mm,
too, and go shopping and support local support local concerns. So and particularly at the moment in the context of COVID and what's going to happen after COVID,
mm,
hopefully after COVID.
mm,
So it is absolutely essential that Archaeworld engages with a much wider audience than just talking to itself about, oh dear, commercial archaeology is under threat. We've got to defend our heritage assets. We've got to learn to talk human
yeah.
and do genuine outreach to take part. Otherwise, we could have a big problem on our hands, and we've only got 3 months to do it. A bit like
Yes,
Time Team. They did it in 3 days. We've got 3 months.
indeed. We need someone coming in going, where's my approachable archaeologist?
Yeah.
Well, we thought we'd
Yeah.
found one on the geophys, but look, we've it's someone with a
Absolutely.
yeah. Anyway, yes. So yes, something to keep an eye out of for, and
Most definitely.
hopefully an exciting special in the near future.
Absolutely. And I'll say, just as one very, very last point, actually,
Hmm.
um, I would do read the whole of the white paper consultation, because it is worth reading, if only for what the government intends to do and how it intends to do it.
Mm,
Which we'll discuss more when we do the special. But
mm,
it, it, it it's not. It is going to be really, really important that people respond.
yeah. Okay.